In 2010, Neil Armstrong broke a 40-year silence to warn Congress about the future of American spaceflight. He wasn't warning them about Russia or China. He was warning them about America's decision to hand human spaceflight to private companies. And here's the strange part. The company that eventually proved him wrong was SpaceX. But 9 years later, America really did lose independent access to human spaceflight. Just not in the way Armstrong expected. What he was there to oppose was a budget. The White House had just proposed canceling Constellation, the program meant to replace the space shuttle, and redirecting billions of dollars toward private companies that would build the taxis instead. NASA would buy rides. It would stop owning the vehicle. A month before the hearing, Armstrong had co-signed an open letter with Jim Lovell and Gene Cernan. Apollo 11, Apollo 13, Apollo 17. The first man to walk on the moon, the man who almost didn't come home, and the last man to leave. Cernan later told the Senate they'd picked their words on purpose, and the words they picked were devastating, third-rate stature, and a long downward slide to mediocrity. Now here's the part that gets flattened every time this story gets retold, so let me be as clear as I can be. Armstrong never said the words SpaceX. He never said Elon Musk. Not in the letter, not in the Senate, not at the House hearing 2 weeks later. He was arguing against a policy. He was arguing that if you hand the job to companies that haven't done it yet, you will lose the ability to do it yourself before anyone else proves they can do it instead. And in May of 2010, that was not a crazy thing to believe. It was arguably the mainstream position. Because look at what SpaceX actually was that month. Falcon 9 had never flown. Its first launch was still 3 weeks away. Dragon had never carried anything anywhere. The company's entire orbital track record was a small rocket called Falcon 1 that had failed 3 times in a row and succeeded once on the 4th attempt in 2008. A flight Musk has said openly was the last one they could afford. If that launch fails, there is no SpaceX. There's no Starlink, no Falcon Heavy, none of it. The company was that close to not existing, 18 months before Armstrong sat down at that table. So when Gene Cernan told the committee that the switch could leave the United States with a gap of up to a decade between the shuttle's retirement and a reliable American replacement, he wasn't being dramatic. He was doing arithmetic. He also mentioned something else that stuck with me, that NASA's own administrator had privately raised the possibility that the agency might end up having to subsidize these companies if they ran into trouble. Okay, so what actually happened? The shuttle flew for the last time in July of 2011. The next time an American astronaut launched from American soil on an American rocket was May 30th, 2020. That's just under 9 years. Cernan said up to 10. And during those 9 years, the United States bought seats from Russia. NASA's Inspector General laid out the bill, roughly $4 billion for around 70 Soyuz seats. The price climbed the whole way. Early on, it was about $21 million a seat. The last one NASA bought cost about $90 million. And here's the detail that really lands. After 2017, which is the year the commercial companies were originally supposed to be flying crews, NASA had to go back and buy 12 more Soyuz seats at an average of just under $80 million each. Another $1 billion, spent almost entirely because the American replacements were late. Delays, cost overruns, years of paying a foreign government for access to orbit. And it wasn't just one company running behind either. NASA awarded the commercial crew contracts in 2014, about $2.6 billion to SpaceX, about $4.2 billion to Boeing. Both were supposed to be carrying astronauts by 2017. Neither was close. So the easy version of this story, old astronaut doesn't get it, gets embarrassed by the future, falls apart the second you check the numbers. On the risks, he was basically right. Where he was wrong is subtler, and it's more interesting. He assumed the failure mode was that the private companies wouldn't be able to do it. What actually happened is that one of them did it so completely that it swallowed the entire category. Reusable boosters landing on ships, launch cadence nobody in the industry thought was physically achievable, a Dragon capsule that's now flown a dozen crew rotations for NASA. Musk, for what it's worth, took the criticism hard. In a 2012 interview on 60 Minutes, he was asked about it directly, and you can watch him try to hold it together. He said, "Those guys are heroes of mine." He said he wished they'd come out and see the work. That segment later drew enough pushback over how it portrayed those astronauts that the broadcast issued a clarification. Now watch what happened to the other side of that argument. Boeing was supposed to be the safe one, the one with the heritage, the institutional muscle, the 60 years of building spacecraft. Starliner flew its first crewed test in June 2024. NASA classified that mission as a Type A mishap. Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams went up for about a week and came home 286 days later on a SpaceX Dragon, and it hasn't recovered. A NASA Inspector General report released on June 30, 2026, put Starliner's certification at 2027 at the earliest, with helium leaks and propulsion problems still unresolved, and openly raised the question of whether it gets certified at all. A month before that report, NASA had already filed to award 6 more crew missions directly to SpaceX without competition, and the paperwork said why in plain language: technical issues and schedule delays encountered by Boeing. So here's where the United States landed. It stopped depending on Russia. It now depends on one American company. Not primarily, not mostly, only. And that company isn't quite the thing it was either. In February of 2026, SpaceX absorbed xAI in an all-stock deal valuing the combined business at $1.25 trillion. On June 12th, it went public on the NASDAQ, raising $75 billion at a valuation around $1.77 trillion, the largest IPO in history. In July, the AI division got folded in under a new name. The company that flies every American astronaut also runs a social network, an AI lab, and a satellite constellation with more than 10,000 active spacecraft in orbit. I don't think Armstrong saw that coming. I don't think anyone did. But I'd argue that's not actually the question he was asking. Read the letter again. The thing he kept circling was skill and experience, where the capability to fly people lives, who holds it, and what happens to a country that stops holding it directly. He assumed the answer to who holds it would be nobody, and that America would just be stuck. The answer turned out to be a private American company, one with its own shareholders, its own leadership, its own commercial interests, and a founder whose political influence now extends far beyond the space industry. The dependency Armstrong was worried about didn't disappear. It changed. America went from depending on Russia for access to orbit to depending, for routine crew access to the ISS, on a single American company. I'm curious where you land on this, honestly. Was Armstrong wrong, or did he describe the right danger and just get the source of it wrong? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely go back and forth on it. And if you want more of these, the arguments that got written off at the time and look different a decade later, subscribing helps more than you'd think. There's one more thing. On May 25, 2012, a Dragon capsule reached the International Space Station, first commercial spacecraft to ever do it. Proof of concept for the exact policy Armstrong had gone to Washington to argue against. Neil Armstrong died on August 25, 2012. 3 months later, almost to the day. He lived just long enough to watch it work, and as far as I can find, he never said a public word about it, which, if you know anything about him, is completely in character. He said his piece once on the record, under oath, and then he went back to being quiet. We got very good at the part he doubted. We got the rockets, we got the reusability, we got the cadence, we got a company worth more than most countries' entire economies. What we still haven't answered is the thing he was actually asking. Not whether a private company could get us to orbit. What happens to a country when the ability to leave it belongs to somebody else?